We are very lucky to be joined this hour by someone that I am a huge fan of. That person is Douglas Murray, the best-selling author of 5 books, including most recently The Madness of Crowds, and also The Strange Death of Europe, one of the biggest books of the last few years. He's associate editor at The Spectator. And this new book, The Madness of Crowds, examines the most divisive issues that we can think of today: sexuality, gender, technology, and race. Douglas, thank you so much for being here.
It's a huge pleasure to be with you, Michael.
Douglas, I loved your first book, or not your first book, but your first book that really launched you as an international star, The Strange Death of Europe. And I thought, okay, you've just written one of the clearest, most damning accounts of the European immigration system I've ever read. So you're going to take on for your next subject something so much less controversial: gender and sex and race and technology. Is that right?
That's right. I thought I'd give myself some time off.
Good. You know, I was watching last week the CNN LGBTQ town hall, which was with all of the Democratic candidates, and it had one crazy statement after the next. I mean, the pandering got so bad that both Cory Booker and Joe Biden actually started hitting on members of the audience who were of the same sex. I guess they thought this would win them a vote. And so because you're such a brilliant voice on this issue, I want to know about The Madness of Crowds, and I want to know specifically how we seem to have gotten here so fast.
Well, I watched that town hall as well, and I have to say it was a real demonstration of the problems I'm trying to describe and have laid out in The Madness of Crowds. I do these issues one by one: gay, women, race, and trans, with these interlude chapters about tech and other things that you allude to. And I thought that what we saw last week was exactly the phenomena that I was trying to lay out and analyze. And if I can explain in as it were, a soundbite, what I think the problem is that we saw there and that we're seeing more widely in our societies, it's that we keep pretending that we know about things we don't, whilst pretending we don't know about things everyone knew till yesterday. So you see, this 9-year-old is dragged up by his proud, adoring mother in the LGBT Democrat town hall last week and says, I'm a 9-year-old trans boy. And absolutely everyone, including Elizabeth Warren, who's on the stage, starts whooping. Now, my suggestion about this is we don't have to be nasty to anyone. We don't have to be mean to anyone. But we do need to be sane. And the adults, in particular, need to be sane and adult. And it is neither sane nor adult to simply whoop and holler when a 9-year-old is, with their mother's encouragement, claiming that they are something that we have absolutely no idea about. Nobody knows what trans is. I lay out the most plausible, reasonable, humane argument for what it could be, but also try to explain, as with gay, as with these other things, what we just don't know about. We don't know very much. Certainly not enough for an entire crowd to be whooping and hollering at a 9-year-old self-affirming. And as for the other people at that, I mean, I'm sorry, but again, I don't want to be rude, but that was heavily populated by escapees from an asylum. that man who'd become a woman who had a name that was deliberately spelt wrongly so that the host mispronounced it, and she could then say that she was being mispronounced or her name was being mispronounced and that was an act of violence. And then somebody else grabs the mic and says there aren't enough black trans women. I mean, obviously, this is madness. The problem is there aren't enough adults calling it out. I
wonder if you arranged that entire town hall just to sell books. The timing is a little curious. Yes, I think that
my publishers must have done something amazing.
Because this is, of course, you know, I at the very beginning of that town hall, a mother went on stage and said, I'm the mother of a 9-year-old transgender child. And I thought, oh, this is really awful because we're affirming what really looks a lot like child abuse from the very beginning of the town hall. And then I thought that would be the depth of depravity for the town hall. Of course, I was wrong because they dragged this little child up on stage. I wouldn't even play the clip on the show today. I didn't want to participate in that at all because the line that you'll hear from the left which will tell us that we need to take children who at 3 years old, and that's not an exaggeration, this has occurred with children as young as 3 years old, that if they decide one day that the little boy wants to be a little girl or vice versa, that we need to block puberty, we need to radically affirm this view and this imaginary idea, and we need to permanently alter their life and transform their life because of this fashionable ideology. If you disagree with that, they ask you, well, what do you want? Do you want transgender people to commit suicide?
Right.
As though
catastrophizing.
Right.
The catastrophizing, yes.
They do. There's no evidence at all.
You're encouraging people to kill trans people. You're encouraging trans people to kill themselves. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that is the line. It's that line about violence that the transgender person also said there. And I love your point on the humility of it, because I say, I don't know what to do about gender dysphoria. I don't know anything about it. Sounds very painful, and I certainly wouldn't want to suffer from it. But I don't think the answer is putting children on puberty blockers. I mean, what?
Well, here's one way to think about it: is trans may be something we have to give a great deal of thought to. I think it is. I think that it's something we need to work out. We need to stop pretending we know a lot more than we do. But it is effectively, when it comes to drugs and other things, it's a matter for adults. It is not a matter for children.
Right.
Because decisions that are going to fundamentally alter people's lives can be made by adults. Adults can drink, smoke, and all sorts of things. They can join the army. They can do all sorts of things where they know what the risks involved are and they weigh them up. We agree in our societies that that is not something that children are able to do. But here's the really big thing, if I can say so, is that the reason why America in particular is going so demented about this at the moment, as with all of these issues, and perhaps it needs an outsider to say this, but what I say in the madness of crowds about this, taking these issues one by one, is you're trying as a society in America to run contradictory programs simultaneously. So your society in America is pretending that, for instance, being trans is a hardware issue. That is, nobody has any say in whether or not they are trans. They're born trans. They're born this way, to quote Lady Gaga. But the problem is that at the same time, Americans are being told from the liberal universities like Berkeley, all the way now to major corporations, that being a woman is a matter of choice. That is, being a woman is software, which means that the only true hardware identity in our societies is trans. Well, that cannot be the case. And of course, something that cannot be the case most likely isn't. And the reason why we keep seeing this unpleasant, ugly scene, not just at things like the town hall last week, but more widely in our society, is because these things we pretend we know about actually run against things we know some things about. We know something about men and women. We know what men and women are. We don't know much about trans. So don't try to run a program in a society that pretends that women don't exist, for instance. Or, if people want to do the gay one on this, actually erases gay men and women. Because many of the people diagnosed, about 80 to 85% of people diagnosed with so-called gender dysphoria, which may just turn out to be the neurasthenia of our time. You know, nobody gets neurasthenia any time now. In the 19th century, it was rife. Some things come and go in the medical world, and they're crowd stampedes, not actual medical issues. But here's the thing: is that gay men and women who have fought for their rights for a generation are now being erased by this trans movement, because 80 to 85% of the people diagnosed as having this so-called gender dysphoria will turn out not to have gender dysphoria when they're adults. They will turn out to be happy or otherwise heterosexual or homosexual men and women. That's it. And so our society is doing something literally mad at the moment. And I think it requires more adults to simply stand up and say things that are self-evident.
I love this category you have of the hardware and the software, because you do see these sort of contradictory claims. The born this way, that's the hardware, that's the biology, and the software, which is more liable to change. It's more mutable. I once had a debate with a gender activist who said that I asked them to describe the difference between gender and sex, and the woman said, sex is biological and gender is is not biological. It's not physical. It's socially constructed. And I said, okay, so how does that manifest in the real world? And she said, well, you have men who they look like men, but they're really not men. They're really women. I said, how do you know that they're women? She said, well, you can tell. And then she cited a lot of dubious scientific studies. You can tell because they look like men on the outside, but they have female brains, and therefore they are transgender. And I said, well, yeah, I said, excuse me, I think the brain is a part of the body. I think it's biological. And she couldn't answer that.
Well, but look, you said I knew that person was going to talk nonsense from the first moment you introduced them, because you said they were a gender activist.
Right.
What is a gender activist? Where are they employed? Where's their salary coming from? Who needs them? What problem is there in our universe where people say, you know what we need most at the moment? We need a good dose of gender activists to apply to this problem. Where did that ever happen in human history, that we saw a problem? We said, we could really do with going to gender activist literature to work out what we know about this or how to solve this. These are liars. They are bogus liars. They're making stuff up. It's time that the adults and people who want a reasonable approach to difficult problems take these things away from fake specialists and fraudsters and start to apply adult reasoning to these problems again, without being, and this is my self-appointed task in the madness of crowds, without being intimidated by these fraudsters. Because when somebody says this, makes up this kind of stuff and pretends that the social sciences are actually sciences, and the people who know most about us are people who've made stuff up that nobody believed until 24 hours ago, these people should be ignored. But at the moment in our societies, particularly in America, there is an intimidatory tone which tries to shut down reasonable people from saying what we all see with our eyes.
Of course.
My suggestion is that we don't give in to it.
Yes, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about that, and I don't think anyone's ever called 911 and said, operator, quick, get me a gender activist. I need him over here right now.
Which service do you want? Fire, ambulance, doctors, or gender activist?
But I want to know, I mean, your writing is so lucid, and your speaking is so lucid, and you think clearly, and that is not true, and that is increasingly not true of people, and unfortunately, particularly in America. Your first book that I encountered you in, The Strange Death of Europe, is not the most optimistic piece I've ever read. You do seem to make yourself very clear, and I wonder, is there any hope for us to recover some lucidity, some clarity of thought, some reasonableness in this debate, or are we just increasingly and forever subject to these mad crowds?
Well, you're right. My last book, The Strange Death of Europe, is a very gloomy, pessimistic book about a very gloomy and pessimistic situation in the continent that I'm from. But The Madness of Crowds is actually a rather more optimistic book, because my self-appointed task is to diagnose and tear apart the so-called social justice warrior intersectionalist movement, and then encourage people to do something better with their lives. And you see, I'm sorry to say, I'm a friend of America. I've loved America all my life. I must massively admire it. But America has some problems that perhaps an outsider needs to identify. And at the root of them are the fact that you are becoming an increasingly stupid society, because you are encouraging your centers of learning to persuade American parents to rack up more and more debt, to send their children away to college and make them stupider. And to come out, it's only people who've been to American colleges who lead the world in the kind of gender activist mumbo-jumbo nonsense that you and I have been talking about tonight. It's only from America that this rot has been primarily allowed to operate. And this means that this is a problem that America has to address.
You know, Douglas, I would ordinarily not allow a Brit to so disparage America, except for this small problem that you're absolutely right. And I say this as a graduate of one of those American universities. Unfortunately, we're up against a break right now, so I have to let you go back there in the UK. But thank you so much for coming on. The book is The Madness of Crowds. The author is Douglas Murray, one of the great minds around today, who I would encourage you all to read and even to go down YouTube rabbit holes of listening to his lectures, because he is so good and such a clear thinker, and unfortunately, even his comments about America are sadly true. Douglas, thank you so much for being here.
It's been a great pleasure.
All right. That is Douglas Murray. Go check him out if you somehow haven't already. I'm Michael Knowles, filling in for the Ben Shapiro Show.